For you, Meridel was very difficult. You know, I mean, you didn't. They fired you from all your jobs, and
you have to talk a little louder.
You couldn't even get a job in a restaurant as a waitress though during that time. So.
Oh, the McCarthy period was that was to make you a non-person.
Yeah.
To isolate you. That was their whole technique, and they were very good at that.
Yeah.
But you had a lot of company.
Yeah.
You remember the 10 movie writers that were...
Right. That were blacklisted, yeah.
Yeah. There was a wonderful thing on the TV recently of the lives of these blacklisted writers. Did you see that?
Yeah, I saw that.
It was very good.
Rob, could you talk again, just and remember, you are going to have to speak up. So.
Okay, yeah, I am.
Is this mic on?
Testing 1, 2, 3. Test check.
Tap it.
Okay. Seems like he's giving up on hers more than he is.
Shouldn't be. Hers is facing.
Is there a better place for it on me, or do we have the connection there?
There we go.
You got me?
That did
That did it.
Really?
The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hi, welcome to Northern Lights and Insights. I'm Rob Mitchell. We're going to be traveling to Hudson, Wisconsin today to visit the poet, author, novelist, and biographer, and social activist Meridel LeSueur.
Welcome, Meridel, to Northern Lights and Insights.
Okay.
Tell me, you've been a journalist and an author and a poet, a novelist, a biographer. How do all these things work together? How does it feel to have worked in all these different areas?
I don't separate them. Like, I don't separate prose and poetry. I think they're one. They've been separated by the analytical academic world, but I don't separate them. Why should the prose and poetry is a communication? You just cut out the lyrical part, and you have analysis, which is dead. So I'm against that.
Uh-huh.
They're one and the same thing.
Well, that was actually my next question, because I've always felt in reading your work that there's a great deal of commonality between all the different areas, between biography, between the novels and the poetry. There isn't as much difference.
There shouldn't be. We make things different. We tear them apart, and put them in separate boxes or something. That's part of our intelligence, but that's not real.
No.
For example, the Indian culture has no written language. That isn't because they're not developed. They don't believe in written language. If it's not true, you write it down. They couldn't have had treaties if you hadn't had written language or taken the English language. If it's true, I communicate with you. Culture is communication or love between people. But if it's a lie, they write it. You can apply that to some of our culture, too.
Yeah. Now, tell me, you were first published when you were 14, and you wrote a journalistic account of the Ludlow Massacre. Could you tell something about that?
Well, I was belonged to a culture in the Middle West which was very, very big before the First World War, a radical labor socialist culture, and it was, they had the largest newspaper in the country, the Appeal to Reason was published in Kansas. They had the largest circulation of poetry, the IWWs. It was a complete culture outside of the establishment. So I was part of that. I reported for the labor papers. And I lived near Girard, where the Appeal to Reason was published. It had this tremendous circulation. So I used to be a reporter for them. Well, everybody was a reporter for them and believed in this. So I went to Ludlow when I was 14 to report the Ludlow massacre. And I reported for the labor papers and the old Liberator. Then it became the New Masses, all the radical papers. That was a whole culture. It took the First World War to kill it. Mm-hmm. The dangerous culture in Germany and Europe. Mm-hmm. At that time in North Dakota had a socialist state. Oklahoma was a socialist state. Yeah. You probably don't know that. They don't tell you that in school.
So you started your career at this time, and of course, Ludlow Massacre was in 1914, and then in the latter part of the teens, we saw a great deal of political repression in this country, in the beginning, really, of the Depression for Minnesota and other places. Now, you were coming of age at that time, and you were...
There was repression, but it was the most radical organization of labor that's ever been in the country, outside of the CIO. My father was a socialist mayor of Minot, and socialist mayor of Milwaukee. Debs got several million votes in 1908, running on the socialist ticket. He got 1 million votes in prison in 1918. So it was a tremendous movement. North Dakota had the Nonpartisan League, and they voted the socialism into power. They took over the banks, and the labor movement had more strikes, more organization. They had the big Patterson strikes in the East. The labor movement grew. As I say, it took the First World War to destroy the progressive movement.
Now, you've written a biography of Arthur and Marion LeSueur called Crusaders, and one of the things that seems really important in your literature, in your writing, is this inheritance that you have, that have been brought down through the women in your family. Can you tell us a little bit about Marion, about Arthur and their activism, and about Crusaders, the book?
Well, I think we've sort of lost the history, the radical history. We actually began with the revolution in America. Because and the Middle West was a tremendous democratic struggle. The first free homesteads, free land in the world was in the Middle West. And around that, the utopian colonies, the third parties in 1896 was the greatest third party, the Populist Party. We had a tremendous culture and movement in the Middle West. I say particularly, I think it was because the radicals came here from Europe to the Middle West. In 1898, 1858, 48, when the movement failed in Germany, the German Marxists came to Minnesota and Wisconsin, and many of the immigrants were radical, fleeing being in the war, fleeing oppression, and so we have a tremendous history in the Middle West of a democratic struggle of the people.
And your mother, Marion Wharton, fought for women's rights, for disseminated information about women controlling their bodies and things like that.
Well, in 1914, the women's movement was strong. They got the vote in 1919. The women's movement was tremendous. When I was 16, I marched down Fifth Avenue with the feminists, all in white, thousands of them for the vote. I couldn't vote until I was 19. You don't realize that women didn't vote until 1919. So all these movements were tremendous movements. The movement for abortion and for contraceptives was a tremendous. You could get 99 years in jail for giving out any information on contraceptives. My mother was tried in Kansas City for giving contraceptive to women in Missouri. So the women had a tremendous legal struggle. Of course, they couldn't vote then at all either. So I came up in that movement, and I don't know what I call it. It wasn't a radical movement. It was really a progressive democratic movement of the Middle West.
Mm-hmm. So you had this tremendous movement, and then the First World War came, and then there was a period of repression in the 20s. The Depression really began.
Yes. Well, the First World War was to destroy the workers' movements all over the world. In Germany, the Socialist Party was very powerful. It really was to amalgamate corporate wealth and destroy the democratic movements. That was why it was fought. Because we were told it was fought to make the world safe for democracy. Then after they won, they destroyed the left. And that was, they moved in immediately. The Palmer raids were in 1919. Do you know those?
Yeah.
I say that because you don't learn any of those things in school.
Yeah.
If I was a ruler, the first thing I would do would be to take away history and the language. Especially the history. If you don't know that you were brave at one time, you don't know how to be brave again.
Well, your writing incorporates so much of this history, and it incorporates a lot of, it gives voice to a lot of people who wouldn't normally have a voice. Is that something which is really important to you?
I don't feel I gave them a voice. They gave me a voice. I was their voice. I mean, I don't separate them like that. To me, the people, the farmers and the workers are the power in the Middle West democratic struggle. We had a farmer labor party here. You heard about that? Yes, we did. We had an amalgamation of farmers and workers that brought in Olson as governor.
Yeah.
Of course, they didn't bring in any power to the two houses, so they didn't have much power.
Right.
But it was a tremendous movement of the people.
So when the 30s came along, there was this tremendous period of change happening in America, largely because of the conditions that people had suffered under for so long, but also because of the stock market crash and various things like that as well. You wrote a story that was very important from that time and is still looked upon as being very important, called "I Was Marching."
The 34th strike. Now that was the breaking down. In 34, the average wage in Minneapolis and St. Paul was $10 a week for a 12-hour day and a 6-day week. The average wage was $10 and $12. So that broke that down. And the Citizens Alliance had armored cars here. You couldn't have a union. Citizens Alliance was a powerful force here. They had armored cars on the street. So that began all over the country in 34. And the organization of the unemployed organizations were tremendous. Well, millions of people were hungry. Marches on Washington. And then the development of the CIO and AFL came out of that. The CIO came out of that in 37. So it was a complete economic change. And then the New Deal. That was a complete economic giant step.
And that was a positive time for you as well. I mean, you, not only the experience of feeling a community of people coming together, of workers and producers, farmers, but you also published a lot of material yourself at that time.
Well, there was an audience. There was even a women's audience there. The women were organized in unemployed councils. Had a tremendous struggle of the women down in Hennepin Avenue and First Avenue. The women throwing bricks off the roofs at the police down below. So there was a women's audience that never was before. The Girl was written from that. And the women were starving. They had to come together. There were, great mobs of women in the bus stations to keep warm. And as in the girl, they took over empty warehouses.
Mm-hmm.
They had sewing projects of tremendous growth in the women's struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they got the vote in 1919, so they could vote during that period.
Would you like to read something for us from your writing?
Yes. Well, now, I consider myself a writer, not a writer in the sense of being a individual, successful liar. But I always considered myself in my youth as a voice of the struggle of the people. I mean, like Isaiah in the Bible, and Ezekiel, and Joel. They were radical prophets, speaking for the people. And I came up in a group of writers that were the voice of the people they filled, like as the People's Reason that I mentioned. So I can always consider myself not a special kind of a person as a writer, but a voice of the writers. Like Lorca says that the poet should take the images of the people from them, reflect them, and give them back in a form that they can understand, or that is more valuable than they could express. And that is my idea. Even this I'm going to read from, I wrote during the Vietnamese War for the Women's Union in Vietnam, and there was a lot of touch of women here with the women in Vietnam. They had a women's union in Vietnam, sent medical and even pencils. So one of the women was going to Vietnam, and I wrote this for the Vietnamese women, and it was translated into Vietnamese and circulated in the war front. And it's called Do An Ket, which is Vietnamese for solidarity. So it's very current right now in the struggles of the colonial people. How can we touch each other, my sisters? How can we hear each other over the criminal space? How can we touch each other over the agony of bloody roses? I always feel you near, your sorrow like a wind, in the great legend of your resistance, your strong and delicate strength. And all the time the predators are poisoning the humus, polluting the water, the hooves of empire passing over us all. White hunters were aiming down the gun sight, villages wrecked, mine and yours. Defoliated trees, gnawed earth, blasted embryos. There are no quiet dead and no quiet deed. Everything you touch now is ticking to its explosion. The scab is about to infect. The ruined land is dynamite. Cadmus teeth of dead gorillas gnaw the air. Nature returns all wounds as warriors. The earth plans resistance and cries, live. What strikes you, my sisters, strikes us all. The global earth is resonant, communicative. Conception is instant solidarity of the child. Simultaneity of the root drives the green sap of the flower. In the broken, the dispossessed, is the holy cry. We keep our tenderness alive, and the nourishment of the earth green. The heart is central as lava. We burn in each other. We burn and burn. We shout. In millions of choruses, we appear armed as mothers, grandmothers, sisters, warriors. We burn. Women of the earth bear the weight of the oppressed, bearing us down into deep to go upward from the dark, from the womb, from the abyss of blood, from the injured scream. From below we glow and rise singing. I saw the women of the earth rising on horizons of nitrogen. I saw the women of the earth coming toward each other with praise and heat, without reservations of space, all shining in a light in solidarity, transforming the wound into bread and children, in a new abundance, a global summer. Tall and crying out in song, we arise in mass meadows. We will run to the living hills with our seed. We will redeem all hostages. We will light the bowl of life. We will light, singing across all seas, the resonance of the song of women, lifted green, alive, in the solidarity of the communal love, uncovering the illumined fruit, the flying pollen, in the thighs of golden bees. We bring to you our fire. We pledge to you our guerrilla fight against the predators of our country. We come with thunder, lightning on our skin, roaring womb singing, our sisters singing, choruses of millions singing.
Thank you. Well, I think what I would like to ask you about is the period after the 1930s, a period where you were blacklisted and it was very difficult for you. We were no longer able to publish as frequently. You published children's stories during that time. Could you tell us about...
Oh, it was before the McCarthyism. Published my 5 children's books that were blacklisted later, right after the war, 45. So McCarthyism came in 1954, after the Korean War. I think we came very close to fascism after the war. Almost all the leaders of the New Deal died in 45 and 50. Very strange. Especially now, as you see the activities of killing, assassination, and then we had, if you look over it, it's frightening. We had the defeat of the Progressive Party in 48, the Smith Act and McCarran Act in 50, the Korean War in 51, the death of the Rosenbergs in 53, and 54, McCarthyism. It was really a very organized and very close to fascism that we came. So that was a very tremendous period, the fight against fascism. I think you have a hard time having fascism in the American people.
What effect did that have on you, yourself, and your family in terms of the effect of McCarthy on your work?
Well, we were part of a tremendous struggle. We belonged to a tremendous struggle against McCarthyism. As I said, my mother said, if McCarthy didn't attack you, you were not a Democrat. There was something wrong with you. So we were part of a tremendous struggle. There was a lot of people that were with us. And we were with a lot of people. My father, law business suffered. My mother, we finally had to get a rooming house to try and live, because we were all blacklisted. And the FBI took the rooming house away from us. So it really was but I don't know, we always were part of a struggle. So the American people. You had that before the First World War. There was tremendous opposition to the First World War. That's not hardly known. They had a very hard time having that war. The jails were full of people. American labor movement, even the churches, were opposed to that war. So we've always, it's part of an ongoing struggle. Now it's going on, same thing, against colonial countries and the rising of the people. It's the same continuation of the same war.
Now you had written under the WPA writers in Minnesota. You had written...
that was a wonderful thing. We need another one like that in WPA, instead of the grants, because it was a real democratic, cultural... It was wonderful.
And you taught also through that program, taught other writers.
Yeah. You could have classes in that program. If you got 12 people together, you could have a class and get the WPA wage, which wasn't enormous, about $92 a month, but you could pay your rent and eat on that and then. So it freed the painters. The whole school of painting came up, the theater, writers, the whole people's culture rose under that. Here it was wonderful. We didn't have any famous writers. We just had editors that had lost their papers and writers that had lost their job, and they just reissued their guide. Have you ever the WPA guides, which are wonderful. It was a wonderful thing for the whole culture, I think. It created an audience also.
So here you had, during the McCarthy era, of course, they wouldn't let you teach. They informed your students that had come to you that they should no longer.
No, if anybody came to my classes or rented a room in our rooming house, they lost their jobs. So.
Now, the one thing that strikes me about your writing, and I hope we can get some time to talk about this, is that there's this incredible sense of struggle, but there's also an incredible sense of optimism.
Which you get from the struggle of the people. If you ever came through the struggle before the First World War, you would never lose confidence in the people's. And the American people are very deeply democratic people. You're seeing it now come back again during terrible exploitation and oppression. The American people are great people. They go underground and are silent, then they appear. No, they have a great heritage of democratic struggle. As I say, we came into being from a revolution. Put out one of the first kings that lost their throne.
Now, in the latter part of the 60s, it seemed like there was a resurgence of women's literature, of a women's movement, a resurgence, and you, after the period of the McCarthy era, also started to come back.
Well, the girl had never been published without the women's movement. I mean, women in the 30s didn't like radical women. I mean, they were still defending their marriage, hoping to keep up the middle class idea of the family, which was being destroyed. So the new women's movement gave an audience to all of us. Gave a spirit, and it was incredible. Still is. There's a tremendous women's writing now. Some of the best writing, poetry, is by the new woman, I call her.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your work, there are certain themes which seem consistent throughout, and certain voices, like we were talking about from the 30s, but they're voices of women, but there's a link between women and nature, and women and childbearing, and these are very strong themes for you. Some people call this reductivist. How do you respond? How do you respond to that in your work?
Some women call it reductivist, or
Yeah,
some men call it that.
Probably both.
Well, I went to the International Women's Meeting in '85 in Nairobi, where you saw the women of the world. You saw the third world women for the first time in the world, the third world women equal to the white Western women in power, in numbers, and I think in consciousness. So I saw this tremendous uprising. I wish my mother could see, because she was alone going through Missouri very often, talking about freedom of women. And you'll never get them back in the bottle, never. 70% of all the agriculture now is done by women. 70% of all the sweatshop production is done by women now. And they're the new visible struggle, as well as the new visible to be exploited. So I consider this one of the tremendous power of the not only women, but the feminine consciousness, as you say, of nature. That men suffer from not being connected with that as well as women. And men, I think, are growing a little bit, changing a little bit. They're very slow, I think, in doing, but they're being hurt. So this struggle is continuing now on a vast basis. We talked about the international working class, but it didn't exist in consciousness. Now you can go to any meeting in Minneapolis and somebody appears from Africa, from Guatemala. The steel workers know who took over the production of steel in Brazil and communicate with them. You really do have a global consciousness, which I think is indestructible, unless they drop the bomb. But it's never existed in the world, a global people from the church are hiding people from Nicaragua. Baptists are going to Nicaragua. I mean, the church is resuscitated in its brotherhood and its relationship. I just hope I live 10 years more to see. There's going to be tremendous things happening. You can't ever stop it.
I hope so too. Thank you for joining us, Meridel.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And a special thank you to Meridel LeSueur for being on our program. And thank you for joining us, and I hope you'll join us again on Northern Lights and Insights.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service.